When you look at a geopolitical map, you're essentially looking at this really comforting illusion of order.
Right. Neat little pastel colors for each country.
Exactly. You see these crisp, solid borders, and you just naturally assume that the government listed on the map is, well, the entity actually holding the steering wheel in that territory.
Which is often not the case at all.
No, not at all. And today, we are looking at a map that is basically just burst into flames. We're doing a deep dive into a really tense, rapidly evolving flashpoint.
Yeah, the situation between Israel and Lebanon.
Right. And we're basing this on a recent Patreon post that compiled a huge stack of international intelligence, military updates, and diplomatic statements. But before we get into it, I need to be really clear with you, the listener, about our mission today.
It's an important disclaimer for sure.
Yeah, because this situation involves deeply volatile, highly charged actions across the Middle East, Israel, Lebanon, and Iran. So we are completely impartial here. We are not taking sides.
Exactly. We're not endorsing any of the military actions or political viewpoints we're going to mention.
Right. Our sole job today is to just strip away the spin and impartially map out the reality on the ground so you can actually understand the mechanisms driving this crisis.
And the core tension we're dissecting today is really this massive collision between military momentum and, honestly, diplomatic panic.
Diplomatic panic is a good way to put it.
Right, because on one side you have Israel officially launching what it categorizes as limited ground operations into southern Lebanon against Hezbollah.
But then, on that exact same day, you have this unified coalition of 5 major Western nations.
Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom.
Right, and they issued this urgent joint statement demanding that a major ground offensive be avoided at all costs.
So you're basically watching the traditional mechanisms of global diplomacy scrambling to halt a military reality that's, already in full swing.
Yeah, and this current collision didn't just materialize out of thin air, right? The actual catalyst for drawing Lebanon into this wider conflict hits on March 2nd.
Right. The inciting incident was a massive geopolitical shockwave.
U.S.-Israeli airstrikes that resulted in the assassination of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And, I mean, the speed of the fallout from that single event is just staggering.
It really is. Because the mechanism of proxy warfare is so crucial to understand here.
Break that down for us.
Well, when a major state leader like Ayatollah Khamenei is assassinated, the response doesn't always come from the state's official military. It comes from the network of allied militias and paramilitary groups they support across the region.
Right, like Hezbollah.
Exactly. Hezbollah, operating out of Lebanon and heavily backed by Iran, immediately launched a barrage of rockets at Israel in direct retaliation.
So it wasn't just some isolated border skirmish.
No, it was a highly coordinated activation of that proxy network, and Israel's response to that was an intensive, widespread bombing campaign across Lebanon.
Intended to cripple Hezbollah's operational capacity before they could launch a sustained offensive, which brings us to the boots on the ground right now.
Right, the ground operations.
Yeah, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz officially confirmed the start of ground operations in southern Lebanon. But the phrasing the military uses here is what I really want to examine.
The limited and targeted phrasing.
Yes. Israeli military spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Nadav Shoshani explicitly described the offensive as limited and targeted, noting that soldiers are operating in new locations.
So the strategic logic behind that phrase is very specific in military doctrine. From the Israeli military planner's perspective, they aren't executing a full-scale border-to-border invasion to capture Beirut.
Okay, so how are they defining it then?
They define the operation by specific tactical objectives, things like neutralizing immediate border threats, dismantling tunnel networks, and destroying weapon caches that facilitate rocket fire into northern Israel.
Right.
By keeping the geographic scope restricted to those strategic points, they categorize the whole operation as limited.
See, I have to challenge that definition, though, because limited is a very boardroom word.
It definitely sounds sanitized.
Yeah, it sounds highly controlled, like a surgical procedure where you make a tiny incision, remove an anomaly, and stitch the patient back up. But applying a surgical procedure to a deeply volatile geopolitical body, well, the patient's reaction is entirely unpredictable.
That's a really good analogy.
And furthermore, if you are dropping massive ordnance to pave the way for that ground operation, the surgical analogy falls apart entirely.
Completely.
You cannot conduct a limited ground operation if the prerequisite is an intensive, widespread bombing campaign that devastates the surrounding environment. For the civilians caught in that theater, There was absolutely nothing limited about it.
You're absolutely right. The discrepancy between strategic military phrasing and the physical reality on the ground is just vast.
It's two different worlds.
Exactly. A commander viewing a satellite map sees a targeted strike on a munitions depot, but the population living around that depot experiences catastrophic infrastructure collapse.
Hmm.
And that physical reality is precisely what is terrifying the international community right now. The fallout just cannot be contained to the specific tactical objectives.
Which brings us to the numbers coming out of the Lebanese health ministry, and they paint a really grim picture of that fallout.
The statistics are devastating.
Yeah. This military campaign has already killed at least 880 people, including women and children. It has wounded more than 2,000. But the statistic that fundamentally alters the landscape here is the displacement.
The mass evacuations.
Right. More than 800,000 people have been forced from their homes.
Wow. And, moving 800,000 people in a matter of days is not just a humanitarian tragedy. It is a complete systemic collapse of civil society.
How so?
Well, to understand the mechanism of that collapse, you have to look at the evacuation orders driving it. Israel has issued evacuation mandates covering massive swaths of southern Lebanon, extending more than 40 kilometers from the border.
Let's just contextualize what a 40-kilometer evacuation zone actually means for a sovereign nation.
It's huge.
Yeah, that's roughly the length of a marathon. This isn't just asking people to move to the next town over. Pushing a population 40 kilometers deep into a country effectively erases entire regional economies overnight.
Absolutely.
You're abandoning agricultural sectors, you're shutting down power grids, emptying hospitals, and the areas receiving those 800,000 displaced people instantly face their own crises.
Because local infrastructure just buckles.
Right. The water, the food supply, the medical care, it all just collapses under the sudden population surge.
You are basically watching the cascading failure of a state's ability to function at all. And a crisis of that magnitude inevitably generates massive shockwaves in global capitals.
Especially in Europe, right?
Yes. European nations in particular are hypersensitive to this exact scenario. A protracted conflict in the Levant historically triggers massive refugee waves toward the Mediterranean.
Which then causes intense domestic political fracturing across Europe.
And economic disruption, yeah. That hyposensitivity explains the unprecedented diplomatic intervention we're seeing.
Right, going back to that joint statement published on the Canadian Prime Minister's website, the leaders of Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the UK.
And they explicitly warned that a major ground offensive must be avoided, citing the devastating humanitarian consequences.
But with 800,000 people already displaced, how much leverage does a strongly worded joint statement actually have in altering the trajectory of such a massive, fast-moving crisis?
Well, the coalition of these specific 5 nations is a powerful diplomatic signal. You have the major economic and military pillars of Western Europe, alongside Canada, attempting to leverage their combined weight.
Oh, but does it work?
The power of their statement actually lies in how they structure their demands. They don't just issue a blanket condemnation of the violence. They draw a very sharp, very deliberate distinction between the sovereign state of Lebanon and the forces of Hezbollah.
Because when you read the fine print of their demands, they are threading a very delicate needle.
Very delicate.
On one hand, the joint statement calls for meaningful dialogue between Israeli and Lebanese representatives for a sustainable political solution.
Right.
And they express full solidarity with the Lebanese government and the people, specifically noting that the civilian population has been drawn into the conflict against their will.
That framing is essential. By stating the Lebanese people are involved against their will, these 5 nations are legally and diplomatically separating the official government in Beirut from the actions of the paramilitary group operating in the south.
But then, on the other hand, the coalition explicitly condemns Hezbollah's decision to join Iran in these hostilities. They demand that Hezbollah cease its attacks on Israel, and most notably, they demand that Hezbollah disarm.
Which is a massive demand.
Yeah. The statement pledges support for the Lebanese government's efforts to disarm Hezbollah and ban its military activities.
And this brings us to the fundamental paradox of the modern Lebanese state. A defining characteristic of any sovereign nation is that the official government must hold a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force. Lebanon does not have that monopoly.
To understand how bizarre this dynamic is, imagine Lebanon as a massive corporation, right?
Okay, I like this.
The official government is the C-suite and the board of directors. They hold the legal titles, they sit in the glass offices, they attend the international shareholder meetings.
You're all the official business.
Exactly. But down in the manufacturing wing, there is a rogue shareholder who has built their own private security force. And that private security force is actually bigger, better trained, and more heavily armed than the corporation's official security.
And the board of directors has zero control over them.
None. But when that rogue shareholder decides to start launching attacks on a rival company, the rival company responds by bombing the entire corporate headquarters.
It's a perfect analogy. That dynamic is known as a state within a state, and Hezbollah is perhaps the most prominent example of it in the world today.
They just have so much power.
Oh, absolutely. Over decades of deep entrenchment, heavy foreign backing from Iran, and providing massive social services to their constituents, Hezbollah has grown into a formidable military organization. Their military wing vastly outguns the official Lebanese armed forces.
Which makes that five-nation demand seem entirely disconnected from reality.
In a practical sense, yeah.
I mean, how can the international community demand that the Lebanese government disarm Hezbollah when everyone knows the official government doesn't have the firepower to do so?
They don't.
Asking the Lebanese state to forcibly disarm Hezbollah is effectively asking a weaker force to initiate a catastrophic civil war against a stronger force, right in the middle of an international invasion.
The five nations are fully aware of that reality. However, diplomatically, they have no other choice but to make the demand.
Why is that?
Because international law and global diplomacy are entirely built on the framework of sovereign states. To admit that the Lebanese government has no control over its own territory is to admit that the entire global framework is broken.
So they just have to play along.
Exactly. The allied nations must uphold the fiction of state sovereignty. They must pretend the C-suite is in charge, even if the rogue shareholder is running the factory floor.
Wow. Okay, so that unified front from Canada, France, Germany, Italy, and the UK is an impressive display of allied diplomacy. But as you analyze the source material, the weight of this joint statement is completely overshadowed by who is noticeably absent from it.
The world's biggest superpower?
Right. The United States is entirely missing from this coalition.
And in high-level global diplomacy, an intentional absence is often a louder policy statement than a signed declaration.
Yeah, and reporting from Axios reveals exactly why the U.S. abstained. The U.S. position diverges sharply from its European ally.
It's a totally different approach.
While the five nations are demanding an immediate halt to avoid humanitarian disaster, Axios reports the U.S. has largely supported Israel's military operations against Hezbollah. The text actually includes a direct quote from a U.S. official stating, "The Israelis must take the necessary actions to stop the bombing of Hezbollah."
We are looking at a fundamental split in strategic priorities among Western allies here.
Break down that split.
While the five-nation coalition is prioritizing immediate regional stability and humanitarian relief, the United States, however, is prioritizing a broader strategic objective: the permanent degradation of a major Iranian proxy force.
So they're willing to accept the immediate fallout.
Exactly. The U.S. calculation is that dismantling Hezbollah's military infrastructure is a necessary action for long-term security, and they are willing to accept the short-term escalation and instability to achieve that goal.
But doesn't the U.S. position effectively neutralize the demands of the other five nations?
In what way?
Well, if Israel has the tacit support of their primary military and intelligence partner to take necessary actions, the diplomatic leverage of Canada or the UK saying a ground offensive must be avoided practically evaporates.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
You cannot form a viable diplomatic blockade if the biggest player on the board is literally holding the door open.
Tactically speaking, you are correct. The military reality on the ground is dictated by the powers supplying the hardware, the intelligence, and the geopolitical cover at the United Nations.
Right.
The five-nation statement provides immense moral pressure and highlights the severe humanitarian stakes, but without the United States applying coercive diplomatic leverage, it just lacks the teeth to force a halt to military operations.
And that fracture on the international stage mirrors a deeply tragic contradiction happening inside Lebanon's own borders at this exact same moment. The paralysis of the state is just on full display.
You essentially have two completely different realities operating under the same flag.
Look at the official state leader, Lebanese President Joseph Aoun. He is utilizing every traditional diplomatic channel available to a head of state. He is actively calling for direct negotiations with Israel.
Right, he was just at a UN Security Council session recently.
Yeah, practically begging for international support for a ceasefire. The official state desperately wants peace.
But a ceasefire fundamentally requires the actual combatants to agree to stop shooting.
Which is the fatal flaw in the president's diplomatic push. Because at the exact same time President Aoun is at the UN pleading for a ceasefire, Hezbollah leader named Qassem is taking a completely defiant tone.
Total opposite direction.
Qassem is not entertaining peace talks. He is actively taunting the Israeli military, publicly warning that an Israeli ground invasion is a trap they will fall into.
Wow.
He views the escalation not as a crisis to be avoided, but as a strategic opportunity to bleed the Israeli forces in asymmetric warfare.
The whiplash between those two stances perfectly encapsulates the breakdown of the nation-state model. President Aoun can sign all the ceasefire agreements he wants in New York, but he does not control the personnel actually firing the rockets in southern Lebanon.
It's just wild.
You have a government negotiating for a peace it cannot enforce, while a non-state actor actively invites the war the government is trying to prevent.
This entire deep dive serves as a stark masterclass in the immense complexities of modern conflict.
Really does.
I mean, we've traced the rapid military escalation triggered by the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. We've examined the catastrophic mechanism of mass displacement, where an 800,000 person evacuation just cripples a sovereign state.
And we've seen how deeply fractured international alliances become when strategic objectives collide with humanitarian priorities.
Exactly. And tying it all together is the stark realization that achieving peace is nearly impossible when the official government of a nation and the heavily armed militant group operating within its borders have completely contradictory goals.
The political maps we rely on, with their clean lines and neat categories of sovereign nations, they simply do not reflect the anatomy of the real world anymore.
No, they don't. The entities holding the legal titles are not necessarily the ones holding the power.
It forces us to recognize the severe limits of traditional diplomacy in a landscape dominated by proxy forces and asymmetrical warfare.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to explore today. Given the deeply conflicting realities we've mapped out, the 5 Western nations desperate to avoid a protracted crisis, the U.S. supporting necessary military actions, the Lebanese government pleading for a ceasefire, and Hezbollah eagerly welcoming a ground war as a trap. What happens to the future of global diplomacy when the ultimate fate of an entire region is being dictated by non-state actors who aren't even sitting at the negotiating table?
That is the big question. The entire architecture of international relations may have to be redesigned to answer it.
We'll leave you to ponder that redesign. Keep questioning the lines on the map, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.